Welcome to Fertility Friendly Food. I'm your host, Stefanie Accredited practicing dietitian and nutritionist and director of the Dietologist, an Australian-based practice focused on optimizing fertility through nutrition. This podcast will bring you snack-size episodes for you to learn, grow, and be inspired by the latest research, facts, and practical lifestyle tips about eating well for optimal fertility, helping you cut through the confusion and myths to take back some of the control on your fertility journey, one bite at a time. Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Fertility Friendly Food, the podcast. My name is Stefanie Velakis, and I am an expert fertility dietitian and nutritionist and founder of the Dietologist. And today we have a special guest, Aidan from Ideal Nutrition, who's an accredited practicing dietitian and accredited sports dietitian. And we will be picking his brains about all things sports, supplementation, and fertility. Welcome, Aidan.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited for this. It's a little bit outside of my normal stuff, but yeah, super keen to talk about it.
Yeah, you know what? Just before we hopped on this podcast, I was just doing I'm working on a bit of an annual report at the moment, which I've never done. And I'm feeling very lost with it all. But I was looking at some of our blog analytics for the whole year. Yeah. And the guest blog post that you did on this topic about sports supplements and fertility is like in one of the top 10. So it's definitely of interest to people. So I am keen to get it into a podcast format.
Yeah, for sure. And like that's interesting to me, but it makes sense because like when I was doing the research for that blog post on this topic, I was like, no one talks about this. Like there's no one else who's writing about this or speaking about it or anything like that. So like there's not much to look for if somebody does want information on it.
Yeah, totally. And when I work with clients who, males or females, who are really into sport or training or, you know, their physique, I get so many questions about it. Yeah. And it is such an overlap arena of like, it's affecting their fertility, so I need to know about it. But I don't have that much expertise in terms of the sports supplements. And so I was like, just be really good to have a really solidly researched piece of information to send people to. And it's also gotten some media inquiries as well off the back of that, which is really awesome. So no, I'm keen to get stuck into today. But before we do, can you tell us a bit about who you are, what you do, what you're all about?
Yeah, so as you said, dietitian and sports dietitian. I run my own business called Ideal Nutrition, which is it's mostly consulting. So all the income comes from consulting, but I see it as a 50-50 split between like I see the Instagram side of things and the blog side of things as a job as well. Like I try to work about 40 hours per week. So I try and do like 20 hours with seeing clients and stuff like that and 20 hours on the content side of things. And I also have two dietitians working for me. So one is in a client-facing role, the same as me, and then the other is helping me out with content and stuff like that. So yeah, it's just
That's
a split.
Awesome.
Yeah, split between content and seeing clients.
Yeah, I totally agree. Content is part of the job, part of the business, even if it doesn't directly give you a dollar value, because I don't do any sponsored content anymore.
Yeah.
So yeah, it doesn't make me anything in that way. But yeah, I definitely see it as being a huge part of the business. And actually that throws me back to having conversations with some student dietitians in the master's program at Sydney Uni when I was teaching. And we do this business topic, like a whole subject on business, which is great. But I often would get the question of, oh, how many days a week would you see clients? And I would tell them, they're like, so what do you do with all that other free time that you have? I was like, what free time? Yeah. Content takes a long time.
It does.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. So Ideal Nutrition. So we'll shout out your handles at the end. But can you talk us through, Aidan, what some of the most popular sports supplements are that you see in your practice and your dietitian sees in your practice amongst both females and males, if there's any difference between them, or whether particularly maybe males or females use these things more than others? I'd be curious to hear your thoughts.
For sure. So like I'd say the most common ones, not really talking gender specific stuff right now, but like most common ones I'd say are creatine, protein powder, omega-3s, amino acids, and caffeine, if you'd class it in there, because it comes in various forms like pre-workout and stuff like that. You've stumped me a little bit with the gender differences because, like, to a certain degree, there is like gender differences. Like, I feel like women are less likely to be taking protein powder than men, for example. Like little things like that. Like, there's not many specific reasons for many differences and stuff like that. But I think just like preferences are slightly different.
I totally agree. And that's exactly why I popped that in there, because I find the questions that I get in my practicing couples and male-female couples is that the males will ask lots of questions about this, and rarely do I get females asking questions, minus maybe protein powder, which we'll talk on a little bit more later in around pregnancy in particular. But yeah, that's why I was curious to hear your thoughts, because, there is no difference, right, in terms of the research about using creatine for males versus females in terms of how it enhances performance. Is that right? Yeah,
there's no noticeable differences. It seems to help for both parties, really.
Yeah, so the only reason would be out of preference or wanting to experiment with certain things.
Yeah, I suppose I'll touch on creatine with that one as well, because the one thing that does make a difference, a gender difference a little bit, is because creatine causes a small amount of water retention, like maybe the equivalent of 1 or 2 kilos max. The smaller you are, the less it'll be, the larger you are, the more it'll be. Water retention, particularly in the first 1 to 2 weeks, it seems to settle down after that. I suppose women are more likely to stress over their weight increasing than guys do. Like, a guy looking to get jack's probably less concerned that their weight's gone from like 85 to 86, but like, I don't know. Yeah. That's another difference, I'd say.
Yeah. No, I hear you. I think any little bit of water retention in general, generalizing, females are a little bit more sensitive to, because we experience that every month as it is.
Yeah.
So any additional, it's like, what is going on here?
Yeah.
So that's totally fair enough. What's the evidence behind some of those most popular ones that you mentioned there? So we've got creatine, we've got omega-3s, caffeine, protein. Was there another one that you mentioned? Amino acids.
Amino acids. So I'll start with creatine. Creatine I see as the most evidence-based supplement in terms of, if you got together 10 studies on creatine for performance, like lifting and stuff like that, I'll come back to more specifics on that. If you got like 10 studies together, 9 of them would be favorable and the 10th might show like no difference. So it's just like, the odds are very stacked in the favor of creatine. Like, whereas there can be other supplements where it's like 50-50, like 50% show some benefit, 50% show like no benefits. Creatine, pretty consistent, and like, it helps with a wide variety of things, but like the main thing people use it for is it helps with ATP regeneration, which is basically like the first stage of anaerobic metabolism. Like, think like exercise that doesn't require oxygen, like sprinting and stuff like that. The first real 10 seconds is what creatine's really, really useful for. But to add on to that, the outcomes focus, the stuff that I care about, is if somebody was training, lifting weights and stuff like that, and they took creatine for 12 weeks, they would gain more muscle than if they didn't take creatine at all. There's only a tiny difference, but it's there. It's enough to care about. And there's a whole bunch of mechanisms proposed as to why that happens beyond simply just better performance leading to better outcomes. It's a bit of a mess as the exact causes, but that's why I boil it down to being like, well, we've got this research showing that if you take it for 12 weeks, you gain more muscle than if you never took it at all. And if you stop taking it, that muscle kind of stays with you for a decent period of time afterwards as well. So it's not like you only have it while you're on it. So benefits of creatine there. Protein powder. The way I view protein powder is it's basically just, it's like getting protein through food. If you had a suboptimal protein intake and you added protein powder into it, you would get better results in terms of muscle growth and fat loss and all of those kind of things. But I suppose the only other addition is it's typically a high quality protein source. So like, if you compared that to a lower quality protein source, it's probably going to come out on top. But if your total protein intake is high enough, it often offsets a lot of these like little debates about protein quality and stuff like that. Omega-3s are really hit and miss. Like, some of the research makes it look absolutely magical. Some of the research makes it look like it doesn't matter. What's obviously complicated, and I'm sure you're familiar with this as well, because I've seen you do some stuff on omega-3s in terms of like testing and stuff like that, because it really depends on your baseline status. It depends on your habitual intake and stuff like that. But like, it's just got a range of benefits from like reducing inflammation, potentially carrying over to heart health and stuff like that. I suppose that's not really relevant for sports performance, but the inflammation one is, there's some research showing it helps with tendon growth and stuff like that. There's research showing that, this is kind of crazy, but like if somebody tears their ACL and they're immobilized post-surgery for a week, there's only 2 studies have been done on this, but omega-3 supplementation seems to help with muscle retention under those circumstances.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's
like
so cool. I mean, 2 studies, but still.
2 studies, yeah. Like
it's still pretty cool.
I'm not sold on it, and I'm not going to go out on a limb and be like, hey, dude, this is definitely going to help. But it is something that's like, if I tore my ACL and I knew I was getting surgery, I would be taking omega-3s in preparation for the surgery. Like it's enough for that, but it's not enough for me to be like, so like there's a whole bunch of positive things, but it's really hit and miss. And like there's some top level sports nutritionists working in the omega-3 space. And like you hear them talk about it, and they're not completely sold on it either. They're not like, hey, take omega-3s high dosages year round all the time. Like it's very much like very, very much more nuanced than that. Whereas like creatine seems to be pretty much everybody should take it who is trying to optimize their performance. Protein powder, if your protein intake is suboptimal. Amino acids, not really providing much benefit. Like that's a deep rabbit hole to go down, but like not really providing much benefit if your total protein intake is already optimized and you've got enough total protein. And like if you had a suboptimal protein intake, you could make the argument for adding amino acids on top of that. But you could also add more protein more easily through other options. Like a serve of amino acids is probably 5 to 10 grams. Like the equivalent of 5 to 10 grams of protein, a serve of whey protein or an equivalent protein powder is like 25 grams of protein. So it's easier and it's also more cost effective other ways. But I added it in the list because I'm like, people do take it. It's a popular supplement. And the last one's caffeine. Caffeine's interesting because it like, obviously everyone knows like all the mental benefits of that. It hypes you up and all of those kind of things, helps you focus as well. But there's interesting research, firstly for endurance athletes, being like if you're doing a long run or something like that, it seems to improve times by 1 to 3%. Some people talk about it in terms of the reduced, I'd say most of the benefit comes down to reduced feelings of pain or reduced feelings of effort and stuff like that. It just makes it feel easier. There's a few other mechanisms, like people talk about fat transportation and stuff like that. I just care about the outcomes. And same thing with lifting as well. There's even evidence that for like as much as like a 1 rep max attempt, like literally just lifting one time, super high dosages of caffeine. Not going to go into specific, but like 6 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. So for a 100 kilo person, that would be 600 milligrams of caffeine, which without going into details, that's probably the equivalent of like 6 coffees. Obviously more complicated than that, but it's a lot is what I'm getting at. It actually helps 1 rep max performance, which is crazy because it's not something a lot of people think about, but like it literally makes people more powerful. So those are common reasons those supplements are taken basically.
Yeah. Oh, that last one about caffeine just took me back to this memory of working with a lovely couple, and they were both trainers. And and the male was a lot more into his lifting and the female was more into her Pilates and so on. And I distinctly remember having a look at his pre-workout to calculate the caffeine. Yeah. And I was like, he's like, can I just have half or can I not have this at all? And I was like, dude, I think this is going to go. Like this is pretty high. And then you're having 2-3 coffees on top. I think
like
going to start to add up now.
Pre-workout's usually about 300 milligrams of caffeine. And like for somebody who's smaller, it starts getting up to that high end as well. But then you add the coffee and everything like that on top of that, and it gets pretty crazy. And like the other thing that gets me, this is not on the topic of what we're talking about, but like a lot of people do that super high dosage pre-workout when they're training after work. And it's like, sleep. You're not going to sleep. Like you ask 50% of people who do that and they say caffeine doesn't affect their sleep. But I'm like, that's not what the research shows. Like the research shows that almost everyone in that position is going to have their sleep quality and maybe quantity impacted as well. Yeah. Even if it's not perceptible in terms of how you feel or sleep latency, right? Like how long it takes you to fall asleep. It might just be the quality of the sleep once you actually are asleep. 100%. Yeah, totally. Now, switching gears a little bit, thinking about fertility, how, going in turn with each of these things, these supplements we've discussed, do they have a potential positive, a potential negative impact on either female or male fertility? If, somebody's listening to this who's
into their lifting or into their training and are using these supplements under the guidance of somebody like yourself or have kind of self-directed, what should they do? Should they stop taking everything? Can they keep some stuff? What things are like a real no-no?
So I guess the spoiler alert is a lot of these things don't matter. I'm going to start off with like at the other end of the spectrum. I'm going to start off with like the one that's more interesting, something that we spoke about with that blog and everything like that, the protein powder aspect. So protein powder inherently does not cause issues to start off with. If it did, as I said, protein powder is like food. It's like if you have one server, that's like 30 grams of protein. It's the equivalent of having like 100 grams of chicken breast. If protein powder was off the cards, you'd have to start worrying about having 100 grams of chicken breast. Like you'd have to start worrying about like all these little details if that was an issue. So that's fine to put that out there to start off with. But one of the things that's really fascinating is there is a risk of cross-contamination with other banned substances, pro-hormones and things like that. So think anabolic steroids, but like kind of variations on that. So there's been some studies that have been done on male fertility showing reduced sperm health basically and reduced male fertility for people who are having protein powder on a regular basis. These studies haven't been done in Australia, and I'm not as concerned in Australia, but it is still food for thought, and I'll come back to circling back to like what I would actually do if I was concerned. But there's been another study. I've had it up in front of me. I might actually get it back up very quickly. But there's a study on protein powder basically outside of Australia. This is in the early 2000s. And 14.8% of protein powders in these international countries. And these are like big name. These are like America and the UK and stuff like that. It's not just like random countries, so to speak. 14.8% were contaminated with noticeable levels of pro-hormones. Like enough to actually impact male fertility because, like, as you know, when people take testosterone and stuff like that, male fertility is reduced. Blows my mind. And that's enough that I was like, hey, if I was struggling with fertility or something like that, bring it back to Australia. We've got better rules and stuff like that in Australia. It's much less likely for it to happen. But we have a thing that we use for athletes who are worried about this cross-contamination because that's the classic. Whenever an athlete fails a drug test, they're always like, "Oh no, I wasn't taking anything. It was my supplements." So to get around this in Australia, we've got this thing called there's tested products where they batch test the products and they confirm that they're not having any traces of banned substances. And there's HASTA certified, so that's the abbreviation, like HASTA, and then there's Informed Sport approved. And if you look on a supplement, you should be able to find one of those labels or something like that, which basically shows it's been tested. So protein powder is the biggest concern in terms of one of the ones that has been shown to have negative impacts. But that really bypasses that concern completely, so it no longer becomes an issue. We can talk a bit about caffeine. Do you want to talk about caffeine?
Yeah, let's talk about caffeine. I mean, I've done a whole podcast episode on caffeine with my team dietitian, Kaylee, a few episodes back. So people, if you want to listen to that in more depth, you can go into it. But I guess, like we were just talking about, like pre-workouts, like ballpark figures of, they're pushing the upper limit of the daily recommended for males of 200 to 300 milligrams for fertility, and then around 200 milligrams really maxed out for females. More and more research keeps dropping it lower and lower. And I mean, from a fertility dietitian perspective, our stance on it is, whilst I feel like caffeine is essential for my existence like a vitamin, it actually isn't. So it is something that if you can go without, isn't a bad idea. But if you're having, 1 cup a day, it's probably fine. You probably don't need to go to the extreme of cutting it out. But if you're pushing, 2-3 cups a day, roughly 100 milligrams each, then, might be time to get it in check. So if we then layer on top any supplements that could also have caffeine, then that's another issue, right?
100%. Yeah, I completely agree. Like, I think a kind of good ballpark range is keeping it below around 200 milligrams, which, as you said, like that 1 to 2 coffees or something like that, if you're not having any other caffeine containing things. this is where it gets interesting, and I speak about this in the sports nutrition world, because when I start talking about those high dosages of caffeine and people using that as a pre-workout supplement or something like that, but they're trying to get it through coffee instead of through a supplement, becomes interesting because a dietitian named Ben Desbro, he did a study on the Gold Coast showing that I think it was espressos just bought from different coffee shops were anywhere from 25 milligrams to 200 milligrams.
Yeah.
And that's insane because if you use my range where I'm like, 200 milligrams is roughly like, and you're like, I might get 2 coffees, you'd be over that range. But like,
yeah,
I wouldn't overthink it, but I just would probably avoid high dosages. And as you've said, like it's even more relevant for pregnancy as well. Like that's where the research seems to be a little bit more conclusive so far to me than the fertility stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, cool. What would be the next one we could talk about? Another one to consider that, like, this wasn't something I've touched on, but like briefly, like talking about like sports drinks and sports gels. So a lot of people use those as supplements. And it's like, if there's anything that's like a no or whatever, like it's like, you can use these. There's nothing inherently harmful about them. But I come back to the point that obviously they're super high in sugar. How could those easy calories affect weight if somebody was looking to get leaner? If somebody was looking to get leaner, they probably wouldn't want that. And bringing that back to like, there's one statistic that's like, it was a study just showed like a 4% decrease in fertility per point increase of BMI. That's nothing crazy, but it's like, well, you wouldn't want to be having a whole bunch of sugar. And then
and there's like new research as well that's coming out that's Australian that's looking at like added sugar intake, particularly in people that are already maybe a little bit insulin resistant, or maybe already on the pre-diabetes, diabetes kind of spectrum and have high BGLs and blood glucose levels, then that added sugar could be glycating some of their proteins and then creating advanced glycated end products, and that can then impact egg quality, sperm quality, and even implantation by modifying the uterine lining, which is a topic that we've also talked about in another podcast episode. So go back and listen to advanced glycated end products and fertility. But added sugars in the diet is one of the things that you can modify to reduce that alongside cooking methods as well. So important consideration, absolutely.
Yeah, and like the last kind of stat, like I think I've stolen this from your blog, I'm pretty sure. But there's one stat that I think you talked about that's like greater than 7 sugar sweetened beverages per week is associated with a 20% decrease in fertility. And it's like if you had the equivalent of 1 to 2 gels per day or 1 bottle of Powerade or something like that, that's the same as like a bottle, as a can of Coke or something like that. Like even if you're not using it for that, even if you're using it for a performance purpose. And I think that's really where working with a sports dietitian makes a difference, is if you are, even a leisure athlete or an elite athlete and you're trying to conceive or you're thinking about trying to conceive, like there's other ways that you can work on rehydration without without those extra bits, or being strategic about it, right? Yeah, for sure. And speaking of a positive one, I guess for the next one, beetroot juice. So beetroot juice is something that like I'm particularly passionate about. I feel like it's a little bit under the radar, but like basically beetroot juice, it helps with blood flow. It's to do with nitric oxide, but it dilates blood flow. Dilates blood vessels and allows blood to flow through easier. And I'm not going to go through the mechanisms and stuff like that, like, because like that starts to get beyond me. But like there is one study where it's like one study in an IVF clinic where they used beetroot juice with also watermelon, which is high in citrulline, which does the exact same thing, and ginger, which also has similar benefits. And pregnancy rates in that group that was receiving the watermelon, beetroot juice, and ginger kind of concoction, they had like a 41% pregnancy rate compared to the control group, which had a 21% pregnancy rate. And there was a reduction in miscarriages and stuff like that as well. Crazy. Like that's actually really moving the needle for something that's so easy to do. For beetroot juice, if that's what you were going to use, the way I would go about it is if you were going to have straight up beetroot juice, I'd be looking at 500 mil of that. Often for athletes taking it before events and stuff like that, we use shots and we use like 70 mil like concentrated versions. So that's another option. But if you want to go like just like straight beetroot juice, like 500 mil would what I would be looking at basically.
This is so interesting because it's something I implemented in the last 12 months with my clients is the 2-week wait beet juice, which some end up loving and keep drinking said beetroot juice long after. And some are like, Steph, I'm literally holding my nose and swallowing this is vile. But yeah, I think 20% is a huge difference for somebody that's invested a lot of time, energy, and money into a fertility treatment. So anything that moves the needle forward, and I even talk to clients who even say even 1%, I'll take it. So 20% is huge. So people will absolutely be on board with that, and it's something that I cover a lot in my blog on implantation and also in my e-guide. But yeah, they do have those shots as well. I think you introduced me to them.
So they're called beetroot.
Beat it. That's right.
And they're also Informed Sport approved as well. So, like, not that we're concerned about that with that, but, like, it's good to know as well.
Yeah. I mean, and the only thing to look out for and that I tell my clients for with beet juice is that a lot of the products on the supermarket shelf that claim that there's beetroot in them, like, turn it over and look at the percentage because often it's pretty low. Yeah. So if you're not doing it yourself at home and you're getting the juicer out, if you are store buying, look for something that's got a really decent percentage, like 80-90% beetroot. Otherwise,
100%. The most common ones, I think it's a V8 one, Purple Power, and it's like 37%. Yeah, so like I've managed that as well. So the next one I guess to talk about is creatine. So a lot of these supplements, I think it's worth noting, will have a warning label on them saying not to take while pregnant. And like I think that's worth bringing up because it's like there's no evidence saying that they can't be taken while pregnant. It's just a label that the supplement company puts out there to protect themselves. I think it's really, really important to know because I did dig in because I'm like, if I'm going to write about this topic, I better be right. Like, I don't.
I got to be confident.
Yeah, and that's the other thing because it's on your blog too. And if it's on my blog and I'm wrong, I can just edit it. I can change it. But,
you have to contact me.
Yeah, just a hassle. So I was like, I'm going to make sure. And like, it's very, very safe. But going with creatine not only has a like good track record for safety in these circumstances, but like it has been studied super thoroughly since the 90s. There's one group that's been taking 30 grams of creatine per day every single day since the 90s with no reported side effects. No other supplement has been done that thoroughly, and it's kind of like it's one of the most trustworthy ones we've got because of that. Digging deep on the fertility stuff, I couldn't find anything on fertility really, but bringing it back to pregnancies, it is interesting because high-risk pregnancies, there seem to be some benefit for high-risk pregnancies and reducing negative outcomes, so to speak. But that's interesting because it's like it will have this warning label on there saying not to take while pregnant, but it seems to actually quite literally have benefits. So I wouldn't be too concerned about it.
There are so many supplements that are like that. Like, I mean, often I get a very stressed out email as soon as there's a positive pregnancy test about what do I stop, what do I need to change, what dietary things do I need to consider now that I'm pregnant. And, I'll be like, hey, we need to stop XYZ that you were on for preconception or fertility treatments. And they'll be like, but why? Is it bad? Is it going to harm the baby? Yeah. And the answer is probably not for like 99.9% of them. And, people will be like, but I found this paper and it says that, CoQ10 might help reduce the risk of, hypertension in pregnancy. And it's like, well, maybe, but like there's probably not enough data to say keep going. So we'll probably just say stop. And so that's the tricky thing with pregnancy is like, no one's doing the randomized controlled trials because if something does go wrong, the risk is too high. So they're not going to do it. So the only way they're going to get data is like retrospective with people that report they've been taking something and then, they report their pregnancy outcome, which is obviously not as good. So it's tricky. It is very tricky, but we always err on being a little bit overly cautious and under cautious. And then if you're really not sure, speak to a dietitian, speak to your obstetrician and see what they say. I mean, what's your thoughts on, not that you listed these out, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Do you have any use for products like L-carnitine or L-arginine in the sports arenas?
Yeah, so going through both of those, I'll start slightly more positively with L-arginine. So L-arginine basically does what citrulline does. So the reason we supplement citrulline is to increase arginine levels in the body for this nitric oxide effect. We would supplement arginine directly. It's just that it seems to cause adverse outcomes earlier, as in you can't supplement as much. People usually get gastrointestinal upset, basically, is what seems to be the case. So because I don't actually know a ton about arginine supplementation, because it seems very clear that like supplementing citrulline by itself seems to be the better way to go. But I am keeping my eye on it a little bit, because there seems to be like other supplements, which we haven't really talked about, but like beta-alanine, which the reason I haven't talked about is because it is safe during for fertility. It doesn't seem to have any impact, and there's no studies that have been done on it, unfortunately, for this. But there is some talk of beta-alanine dosages being slightly too low, but they struggle to get them higher due to adverse outcomes, as in like it's a tingling feeling called paresthesia, which makes people uncomfortable, but is completely harmless. If you mix beta-alanine with a few other things, including arginine, you can get carnitine levels higher, which is what you're trying. So, like, I don't know, I'm not against arginine, but I don't really use it with people. With carnitine though, carnitine's interesting because it's actually really hard to move the needle in terms of your body's levels with carnitine supplementation. So people typically use it because carnitine is beneficial for fat transportation. So they believe it could play a role in either improving performance due to that, or it could help with fat loss due to that. But the research that's been done with humans, it just doesn't seem to carry over to anything that's being consumed orally. There is a few exceptions to that. And one of the exceptions is when people have like 70 grams of sugar alongside it, like a ton of sugar alongside it allows them to absorb it. But if the goal is fat loss, then you've kind of really offset that by doing that. At the other end of the spectrum, though, some people have played around with carnitine injections, and that seems to increase levels more, but I'm not as familiar with that because I just don't have clients injecting themselves. So, like, I don't know that much about that.
I mean, I do, but it's with IVF hormones. Oh dear. It's the only thing you can really laugh about in that context. No, I was curious to hear your thoughts because they are, I guess, emerging in terms of data around particularly recurrent implantation failure. Which is, I guess, where an embryo is failing to implant, even though it is anticipated that it should. So maybe it's genetically normal and everything else looks good. The uterine environment looks good. You know, as much should be happening as possible. And then statistically, you kind of hit this point of like, why isn't it not working? And so some people fall into this category of recurrent implantation failure. So sometimes that is something that you could consider using with your fertility dietitian. But there is some actually really interesting data around both sperm health and recurrent implantation failure for L-carnitine in particular.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I'd be interested in the mechanism for that. Like, because like as I said with the sports world, like we just make the assumption that the body doesn't absorb it, blah blah blah. The arginine one, if it's the same mechanism, I'd strongly make the way to citrulline would just do the same job. But like that's kind of the same thing with that study in that fertility clinic where they did use watermelon with the dosages high enough to get enough citrulline. Like it's probably doing the exact same thing, just a different method to get there.
Yeah, which goes back to the whole idea of having a decent quality diet in the first place.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. And then I suppose that's like also leading in with like antioxidants and stuff like that. Like, I don't know, every calorie you spend on protein powder or something like that is a calorie that you spend on something that could have been food and could have come with like stuff like antioxidants, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, exactly right. Like protein powder isn't going to give you iron and zinc unless it's been fortified and like.
Then it's just like the same. Yeah, there's another ball game.
and I'll cover this when we talk about protein powders in pregnancy because this is the main issue that I find personally with using them is that especially the ones that are targeted for females, they tend to add vitamins and minerals.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And so it just creates difficulty with supplementation plans. But anyway, what about omega-3s? And female-male fertility. Or I can talk about that.
I honestly, like, when I was, like, re-going through stuff to talk about for the podcast, I was like, I'm just going to be out of my depth on that one. As in, you're going to, like, legitimately, like, you're going to know so much more about it than me. Like, but the way I look at it is it's probably a positive, particularly if somebody's got low fish intake or low blood levels of omega-3s. But, like, I think it's just going to be a positive, and there's no real chance of a negative. Like, I don't know, like it could either do nothing or it could be helpful is the way I look at it.
Yeah. And I think that's the thing with anything is like cost benefit kind of analysis of like, okay, what could go wrong with taking this? I mean, there are very few but important circumstances where taking omega-3 is suboptimal in a fertility context. Certain medications don't match well with it and so on. But, you know, most of the time it does, and there seems to be benefit around egg quality, age-related egg count and quality decline. Male fertility seems to help in a period of 6 months, but not 3 months, interestingly, despite the sperm life cycle being about 74 days. So really interestingly, it's taking longer than that to actually come into effect. And that could just be that blood level thing of like, it's not reaching a level of significance in the
and a lot of
the blood.
A lot of the studies do low dosages. Like they'll give like one to like in the heart health studies, like I was looking at like a while back, I was like, everything is like
grams.
one. Yeah. Like everything's like 1 to 2 grams.
Yeah.
And it's just like, well, they come to the conclusion of this like 7-year long study and they're like, oh, I didn't do anything.
Yeah,
like,
it's not high enough.
What if you did a higher dosage? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's the thing. Often people come to me are taking some fish oil, but often I find it's generally not enough.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, we do omega-3 testing for people, and I think as well it depends on your medical history as well. Like if you've got a history of some inflammatory conditions, you might just need more. And it just depends on what's being identified, and it can also help with implantation. Similarly to beetroot juice, it can help support blood flow and so on. So there's lots of benefits, very few cons, minus, you know, obviously the price of a supplement, but yeah, absolutely. Again, I've got a podcast episode on omega-3s that you guys can tune into as well. So let's talk about females who are trying to conceive or pregnant and protein powder, because this is probably the most popular question I get in this arena. So I wanted to make sure we cover it together in this episode just so it's on the record and I've got somewhere to refer people to when I get this question. But is it okay? Which the short answer is yes.
Yeah.
And as long as we're choosing something that's got a low risk of having any banned substances. And, you know, what are the red flags? Like, does it is it just whey protein that's okay, or is pea protein okay, or is, you know, that kind of as well, those alternative sources of protein?
So like, yeah, I would just go for something that's as minimal as possible. So it's just like that one ingredient, or like if it's multiple ingredients, like for example, if you're going for a vegan protein, typically I'd recommend getting multiple ingredients, like in terms of like soy and rice and pea protein, like a combination, because that covers a lot of amino acids. In terms of like, if you just got pea protein, people will make the argument it's lacking some amino acids. If you just got rice protein, it's lacking some amino acids. Combine them, solves the problem. But like, I wouldn't have many other ingredients. I wouldn't have many other additives and stuff like that beyond that in terms of vitamins and minerals, particularly because I'm a big fan of supplementing what you're trying to supplement, as in you didn't sign up for a protein powder to get a bunch of B vitamins and stuff like that. And like you want it for the protein. And if you have one product that does that, you probably have multiple products that have multiple ingredients, and then you end up with large amounts that are larger than you intended.
Oh my God, magnesium every time.
Yeah.
Magnesium every time. And like anything to do with male fertility and male supplements, zinc. There's like so
zinc
much
ends up
zinc
everywhere.
Yeah. It's just like too much zinc. So yeah, layering things is really important, because you can overdo it, and it might not feel any different. Doesn't necessarily mean it is good for you, though. There is such a thing as too much.
Yeah, and I wanted to come back to that as well. Like, I just think during pregnancy, it makes sense to not do anything extreme. It makes sense not to do anything over the top. Like, you shouldn't, in my opinion, be frequently double scooping protein and like having like a whole bunch of it. I don't think, and the other thing as well is like, how necessary is it? How much benefit are you getting from it? Like, I think you should be aiming for a decent protein intake, but I don't think that is particularly the time to be going super high protein and low everything else, and using protein as a tool to get there. I just think it's as the name says, a tool to supplement your diet, basically.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think as well, like there are certain circumstances where it's something that I would consider more for a person, like outside of a sporting kind of context, which is typically in pregnancy, particularly first trimestral, people that have hyperemesis gravidarum or HG, which is quite a significant prolonged nausea that is
it's
above
hard
your
to get
classical nausea management. It is incredibly difficult to meet any kind of nutritional requirement. So, a protein powder can that has minimal ingredients. I look for the exact same thing. And there's so many like pregnancy proteins that are coming out now. And it's just, they've got folic acid in them and iodine in them. But no, I don't want all that, because you're also taking, hopefully, a prenatal and keeping that down. So I don't exactly love the fact that a lot of the pregnancy protein powders are coming out with the pregnancy nutrients in them. I don't want them in there because it's frustrating as a dietitian to then rejig everything. But and you can't just take half and so on. So yeah, I mean, I think it's got a purpose in that setting, but if people really want to use it, I'm happy to, as long as they've run it through me first for an ingredient check. But I just try to avoid things like lots of added sugars and even, artificial sweeteners and stuff. Try to just keep it all minimal, because chances are you're probably getting some in other aspects of your diet. And, we don't have the best data for artificial sweeteners in pregnancy either. So probably something to just avoid. Not anything sinister, but whether it's got something to do with flavor profile of children and different stuff like that. So it's probably just something to
heaps to think about, and like that applies to a lot of other areas of nutrition as well. But like, it is an interesting one that like there's a lot of people who would want to be minimizing their artificial sweetener intake for various reasons, such as exactly what you just said. But they'll have a protein shake every single day, because I don't think about it, because a protein shake is painted in that light as a healthy food. It's food for thought. There's a lot of people who do that. And like, go back to the pre-workout kind of debate, go back to the BCAAs. If you're having pre-workout and BCAAs and protein intake, you're having artificial sweeteners 3 times in a day before factoring in anything else. And like,
it smells like candy. Oh,
yeah, it tastes very sweet. And like, it's like I don't know. I'm
Jim smells of like this like intense lolly flavor.
Yeah, like I'm generally okay with artificial sweeteners and don't have too many thoughts on it. But like the flavor profile one's relevant. Like if you're having artificial sweeteners 3 times in a day, it probably shapes how you taste other foods as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that then affects your dietary quality, because then if all of a sudden spinach tastes like absolute crap,
and
then
fruit
you probably and fruit doesn't taste as sweet as it once did, and all these things get skewed. You're going to probably be less likely to be enjoying, even if you are forcing yourself to have it from a nutrition perspective. You're probably not going to be gain as much enjoyment out of that factor.
Yeah, for sure.
Is there anything that's like a huge no-no that we haven't mentioned in the sports supplement world for fertility? I mean, we talked about the protein powder and making sure no pro-hormones, and, we briefly mentioned, anabolic steroids and so on. But is there which is not a sports supplement,
no-brainer, but
FYI. But is there anything that's like absolutely off the cards?
No, so I think we covered it. Like I wrote down some notes and I was just thinking, I guess like caffeine in high doses, protein powder. The other one is just like anything in individually really high dosages. And the example that comes to my mind is beta-alanine. So beta-alanine causes that tingling feeling and stuff like that. As I say, it's harmless and all those kind of things. This is a funny, like just personal anecdote, but like a lot of people get that tingling feeling at around the 4 grams mark. Some people get it at 2 grams, as low as that. A lot of people, 6 grams seems most common. I've tried it myself. I've had 10 grams, no tingling feeling. Bit of an outlier. There's no research that's been done on 10 grams. And because I'm a kind of cautious guy, I'm not going to go around having 10 grams every single day, because there's a debate about whether it affects taurine levels and how that could play a role in other stuff. Like it's a whole bunch of things that could go wrong. That kind of anecdote, so to speak, I'd bring it back to pregnancy and fertility, just being like anything that seems safe, I just wouldn't do in stupidly high dosages. Like I talked about that creatine example, that 30 grams per day. I wouldn't go around having 100 grams per day. I wouldn't do anything individual in high dosages that hasn't been studied for a decent period of time, just to be on the cautious side, just in case it impacts things.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, like fertility and pregnancy isn't like your whole entire training life.
It's just a phase.
It's a life stage. You know, you might need to change some things, rearrange some things. Obviously, your body composition is going to change during that process and postpartum and so on. And so, you know, priorities have to shift a little and sometimes sacrifices need to be made. And, you know, I've had to have these discussions with people as well of like, you know, we can't let body fat percentage get too low either, particularly for females, right? So there's lots of delicacies and nuances in this arena that you kind of have to weigh up case by case. But I think as a general rule, like what we've talked about today, was a really helpful resource for people. Anything else to add, Aidan?
I guess the only other thing I'd add is just like saying like I've kind of been reaching to find for pros and reaching to find for cons and like things that we should care about and stuff like that with this. But the fortunate situation is there's not that much to be concerned about. Like it should just be reassuring that like you don't really need to overthink this topic. Like it should just be something you quickly think about, maybe mention with a dietitian, ask a question or whatever. But not that much really needs to change. Yeah.
And I think, you know, just being cognizant of supplements in general when you are in this life phase, and getting them checked or label read by a professional, even if you're just having a conversation with a pharmacist, if you're not going to go see a dietitian. I mean, they're probably not as well trained, but even little things they can pick up, like, oh, that has vitamin A, you can't take that. Yeah. Little things you can make a bit of a difference. So yeah, just bear that in mind. Awesome. Well, thanks so much for coming on, Aidan, and sharing your knowledge. I always find there is such an interesting crossover in the sports supplements and fertility spaces. Some of the things that benefit your clients also benefiting my clients, which is really cool. So I always find it really fascinating. So I appreciate your time.
Perfect. Thank you so much for having me.
Can you tell us where people can find out more about you?
Yeah, so you can basically find me. I've got 3 places. So Instagram, so at Aidan_the_dietitian. My blog / website is www.idealnutrition.com.au. And the new place, which I hope will be out or close to being out by the time this is launched, is I've just started a podcast as well, and I've recorded 5 episodes. So keen to launch that, and that's called the Ideal Nutrition Podcast.
Awesome. Yes, we are very excited to tune into your podcast. We'll leave all those links. And if your podcast is live, we'll leave the podcast link down in the show notes so you can find Aidan and connect with them and say, hey, I really love, you know, referring the clients that don't fit the fertility mold to you and vice versa. So yeah, I really appreciate your time and as always, your knowledge. And I'm sure everyone got something out of today's podcast. Thanks so much, everyone, and I'll see you in the next episode.